What makes an antique valuable? This question gets asked to me a lot, or some variant of it. Now, sometimes it's genuine curiosity, others it's because people want to know about what will make a good investment. The problem that arises with this question is that it groups all antiques into a single category, treating them as a whole, whereas really it needs to be done on a case-by-case basis, as what makes an antique plate valuable, say, isn't the same as what makes an antique pocket watch or a toy. So as such, I'm just going to focus on a few key points which tend to hold true for most categories. Rarity. I'm starting with this one actually to dismiss a common myth that antiques are rare. They're not. If we're using the definition I gave in my video about terms in the antiques world, an antique is anything that's over 100 years old. So I'm not really exaggerating when I say that there are literally millions of these items that exist. A lot of products were produced arguably on an industrial level from 1850 onward. Certainly in the 20th century, mass production means that many goods were produced by the thousand, if not the million. As a result, many antiques survive in large quantities today. Given that the price is driven mostly by demand, there are enough around to be readily available to collectors and therefore they're cheaper. So valuable antiques would be those that have been produced in more limited numbers from day one, or that have had many examples lost since then. So a lot of children's toys, for instance, were put through a lot of grief and didn't survive very well. Others, some items were just really never intended to last. It was expected that they'd be thrown out, so cardboard boxes, etc. In the 19th century, it's quite rare that they made it to us today. Rarity can also mean limited editions and production, unique examples, so paintings, some sculptures, silverware. It should be noted that just because something is handmade, though, it isn't necessarily rare. There's a local artist in my part of France who's by the name of Lucien Henry, or you'll see his painting signed Ed Henry. He was active during the 19th century, so we're dealing with genuine antique Victorian paintings, and he did mostly landscapes, and he did a lot of them, and I really mean a lot. There were hundreds of these paintings, and this means that many of his works that are around nowadays, they're worth maybe 20 to 50 euros if they're in a nice frame, because there were just so many of them about. This is unfortunately true of many small name or Sunday afternoon painters of this period and onwards. Because the paints have become cheaper, it meant that there's just far more painting around. Even though they're handmade, unique examples, unfortunately, they're not necessarily worth a fortune. Age. This ties in more or less directly with rarity. Generally, it's fair to say that the passage of time will inevitably destroy much of what's been produced. It's a sad fact of life, but it's true. If you go out tomorrow, say, and buy 6 new drinking glasses from a shop, how many will be left after a year, 5 years, 10? At the end of the day, a lot of it just has to do with statistics about how much ends up surviving. Items predating around 1850 tended to be handmade, or at least not made on the same industrial scale, and will generally command a higher price for it. When you start getting into 18th century and earlier, many antiques become rare simply by virtue of still being around. For the most part, it's safe to say that the earlier an example, the more valuable it is. Although this isn't necessarily true, as for instance with coins, there are certain key dates where typically mintage rates are far lower. Equally, if you look at ancient coins, staying on the theme, although they're thousands of years old in some case, they still exist in massive numbers, especially Roman coins, and you can buy them for as little as $1 each. This ties in once more with rarity. Condition. Condition is perhaps the single most important aspect when determining the value of a piece, next to rarity. There isn't a single field I know where this doesn't play some sort of a role. Although in some circumstances it's more important than others, even minor hairline cracks or chips in ceramics, glass or lacquer can literally have their value, whereas say a little bit of scuffing on the leg of an Edwardian dining chair might not be such a big deal. As such, it's best to do research into your specific field of interest so as to be sure. Restoration and repair can also have an impact depending on the item in question and how well the repair was done. Time affects the items differently, but almost all are subject to some form of aging or not, with maybe gold being one of the notable exceptions, although even then many would argue that coins, say, should show at least some wear simply through being handled. Actually, in most cases, it's a good thing to see some wear on items, as aging and patina provide some of the easiest ways to date objects, if not exactly, then at least to know that they are indeed old, as opposed to more modern productions. Which is why generally they should never be removed. Once you strip it off, that's it gone. It's important, as a result, to know how time affects different materials and what you would expect to see on an item that has been around for a few centuries. Of course, some patina can be faked, which we'll address in another video about fakes and copies. Sometimes it can be a fine line between where patina becomes damaged or undesirable. Typically, say, rust is a big no-no. Woodworm is also not patina, and they're both something that should be dealt with as they're actively destroying the objects in question. Some dealers and collectors don't want to see any signs of wear and tear on an item. Others find that it gives a greater sense of authenticity and a proof of age. Famous names, these can be from a factory, an artist, a designer, etc. They might not even have touched the item directly. For instance, many designers would have workshops making their items. Provenance, items coming from an illustrious owner or home will tend to be more highly sought after. This can also include certain items that were present at important historical events. However, it should be noted that some proof is almost inevitably required so as to be able to provide some backing to the claims. Quality. Depending on their nature, not all items were made for the same target audience. Those made for richer clients would typically be of higher quality, using better and more expensive materials, and be altogether more luxurious. It's usually safe to say that better quality equals more expensive when you're talking about retail. Following on from that somewhat, certain items, namely those made of precious metals, so gold, silver, platinum, have an intrinsic value purely based on scrap. You can usually calculate how much some of these items will sell for if you just know the weight, which auction houses will usually mention. Grading. Some items can be subject to grading by professional and specialized experts, coins, banknotes, trading cards, etc. This can bump up the price as it serves to comfort some collectors regarding the quality and the authenticity of an item. Fashion. When dealing with antiques, it's important to remember that they're subject to fashion. Simply put, some things are in, some things are out. When something's out, even if it was highly sought after only a decade prior, its value can fall through the floor. Some of the most dramatic instances of this can be seen in the brown furniture and European porcelain markets. I myself have seen instances of beautiful late 18th and early 19th century desks in solid mahogany, so luxurious items, which would once be sold for close to €1,000, struggle to make 10. Conversely, some items which were previously considered all but worthless can double in value, as was the case of many industrial objects. While certain rare items will never become worthless, so to speak, even at the lowest of their desirability, their value can still fall drastically. There are of course more objective qualifications which play a crucial role as well in determining value, but these mostly revolve around aesthetic appeal more than anything else, so cute or quirky tends to sell well. It's something that's very hard to speak about generally and would have to be dealt with more on a item-to-item basis. And there also, should probably point this out, there can be just flukes if you're talking about values at auction. Sometimes two bidders get carried away and that can really drive up the price of an item for no apparent reason. Hopefully this will answer some of the questions asked. Again, it's really a superficial view, and to understand what makes every antique valuable, you'd have to stop on each and every category and go into detail, which would take more time than I have for this video, unfortunately. So if you're thinking about collecting, as always, it's best to do your research beforehand, as some of the factors I've listed are more important than others, depending on what sort of antique you're dealing with. As always, it's been a pleasure, and there will be more videos coming soon. Have a nice day.